Hello again and welcome to Social Psychology, Psychology 346. Today we're going to be talking about some other aspects of the self. Specifically, we're going to discuss self-regulation, self-control, and self-knowledge. So previously we've talked about how the self can help people achieve and strive towards certain goals. And another way that the self can achieve this is through self-regulation. And self-regulation is the idea of purposefully controlling one's thoughts, feelings, or behaviors in order to help them achieve a certain goal. So oftentimes we as humans have many different goals, and oftentimes the way we're currently behaving, maybe the way we're thinking or feeling, may not be meeting the specific goals that we have. We often see discrepancies, as I've mentioned before, between how we're currently behaving and how either we want to behave or how we feel like we should be behaving. And when we fail to meet these goals, fail to meet these ideal goals or ought goals, we can experience different emotions. So when we fail to meet ideal goals, when we fail to achieve the goals that we want to achieve, we often feel agitated. However, when we fail to achieve the goals that we ought to achieve, the goals that we should follow through with, we tend to feel dejected. And goals can compete with one another. We can oftentimes see that these ought goals that we have and these ideal goals that we have tend to compete with one another for our resources, for our time and attention. So do I eat the bag of chips because they're delicious and I want to taste something delicious? Or do we eat the apple because I should eat the apple because it's healthy for me? And oftentimes we use self-regulation to manage these goals. I might regulate my feelings of wanting to eat something delicious in order to make sure I eat the healthy apple. And individuals who can successfully self-regulate on a regular basis tend to have a lot of benefits in daily life. They tend to have more stable relationships. They tend to see more academic success, score higher on SATs, for example. They tend to show less criminal behavior, and they tend to have much better physical and mental health outcomes. But what about people who aren't very successful at self-regulating? Well, we as human beings have very limited resources. We have limited cognitive resources. We can only think about so many things at once. When we need to be able to control feelings, thoughts, behaviors, for example, that takes some resources. And that can lead to some deficits in other tasks that we may be performing. So for example, if we are actively suppressing the thought of a white bear, we may persist less on a task that has a squeeze a hand grip as hard as possible. If we basically are feeling really emotional about all the baby turtles trying to survive in the sand, make it out to the water from the beach, because we're feeling emotional, because we're devoting resources to those feelings, we may end up performing worse on, say, a GRE word problem test. And maybe if we're eating radishes instead of eating delicious food that we want to, we may end up persisting less on unsolvable puzzles because some of these cognitive resources are being devoted to self-regulating, to other tasks. We also have limited attention. We can only actively regulate one thing at a time. And we have something known as the Zeigarnik effect, where unfulfilled goals also distract us. We tend to think about tasks that we haven't completed more often than tasks that we have completed. So, for example, if you need to complete a task, it's good to get all other tasks completed, or at the very least, not try and multitask. Multitasking is not good. It's best to focus on one task so you can devote all your attention to it, so that way you're not performing poorly on all tasks. You're instead devoting all your attention to one. Additionally, we can see people have what's known as wavering commitment. That's when, say, someone has a plan to self-regulate to not eat chocolate, and maybe they mess up once. They think to themselves, well, I've already messed up, I might as well just go for it. And then they decide to just eat as much chocolate as possible. So these individuals who are actively trying to self-regulate this behavior, as soon as they slip up once, they just go gung-ho into it, and in this situation, eat as much chocolate as possible. They would probably generally eat more chocolate than, say, someone who wasn't dieting at all. They just go for it. So what about self-knowledge? We've talked about self-regulation, we've talked about self-control. How can we possibly know everything about oneself? You think we'd be pretty good at knowing ourselves. You think we would know ourselves better than anyone else knows us. Well, that's not necessarily true. Yes, we have the ability to introspect or kind of think about how we think about things, have this kind of direct access to our own inner states that no one else probably has access to. But generally, we tend to know what we do and what we think, but not necessarily why. We have access to the output, these behaviors, these feelings, these thoughts that we experience, but we don't necessarily have access to the process. We don't understand what are the influences that are actually leading to these thoughts, these feelings, and behaviors. And a lot of the research out there suggests that we are not very good at introspecting. We fail to report the stimuli that are actually having an impact on us, and we instead tend to report that stimuli that had no influence on us is what leading us to think, feel, or act in a specific way. So for example, individuals who are shown word pairings subliminally saw the word pairing of ocean and moon, and then later they reported that Tide was their favorite laundry detergent. They were not aware that the subliminal messaging was influencing behavior, and they instead gave other plausible reasons for their choice that weren't actually the true reason for their choice. So we're unaware of these subtle influences that can impact our behaviors, our thoughts, our feelings. And one would think that we would need to be accurate about how we understand ourselves, but that's not really true either. The more accurate we are about our own self-knowledge, the more detrimental it is to our own mental health. People who research self-knowledge, introspection, free will, all these things for a living, are very aware that they have little to no control over their own lives, and they tend to be a lot less happier as a result. It's individuals who have these positive illusions that tend to be in much greater spirits, and they tend to be much more well-adjusted than individuals that have a much better understanding of what's exactly happening. Rather than introspection, a much more accurate way of understanding oneself is through self-perception. And this is focusing on how we as people behave and then drawing conclusions from what we do. We're focusing mostly on behaviors and physiological responses. So some research has focused on what's known as the misattribution of arousal. This is where this kind of goes a little wonky, where individuals were recruited for a research experiment, either on a long bridge over a basically pretty deep valley versus a small little bridge over a babbling brook. For those participants who were on the long bridge, they were feeling a lot of anxiety given they were in kind of a dangerous situation. They were feeling some physiological arousal, whereas individuals on the short bridge were not. And these participants were approached by an attractive opposite sex member, an experimenter, and asked if they'd be interested in participating in some research, and asked them to basically call them if they're interested. And what the researchers found was that people on the long bridge were much more likely to call the experimenter than people on the short bridge. And this was due in part because of some other questionnaires that they had, that they were misattributing the arousal that they were feeling from being in a dangerous situation to sexual attraction for the opposite member, or at the very least, sexual interest from the opposite member in them. So they're using their physiological responses to try and figure out, okay, how am I feeling right now? Except in this situation, they didn't correctly attribute the arousal to feeling like they were in danger. They attributed it to sexual arousal. So we do, in certain situations, self-perceive and use that information to better understand who we are. Another example of this is a study that had participants basically do a menial task, turn a knob for a long period of time, and then afterwards they were told basically that they needed to convince another participant about how exciting this task was and how good it was. Half of the participants were given $20 to do this. The other half were only given $1. The participants who were given $20 to do this thought, oh yeah, okay, I'm being given money to try and convince this person of something that I don't believe, so I'm being bribed to do it. And they did it, but they still didn't believe that it was an exciting task, even though that they were telling the other participant that it was. Those who were only given $1 didn't have that excuse. They were only given $1 to try and create this elaborate explanation as to why this task was great. So instead, they kind of thought, okay, I did this task for a while, I only got $1. Well, that must mean I must have enjoyed the task somewhat, otherwise why would I have done it? So then they started to convince themselves that they actually liked it. And this is what's known as behavior justification. When people go through a difficult task or kind of a long, strenuous task to get little to no reward, people tend to think that, all right, the only reason I could have done that task was because I enjoyed it. And so people end up liking the task more. I found this out very quickly. Raising a small child, you tend to go through a lot of difficult tasks with, at sometimes, little to no reward. And because of that, because of this behavior justification, we end up thinking, all right, if I'm going through all this, that means I really must love my child. So it actually can work out very nicely in certain situations. Lastly, we can think about reflected appraisals and basically understand ourselves through the eyes of other people. We can use our interactions with others, our social environments, as a source of self-knowledge. Other people are understanding us by watching our behaviors, which is a much better way of understanding people compared to introspecting. So in certain situations, other people know who we are better than we know who we are. And so this looking glass self, or seeing ourselves through the eyes of others, can actually be extremely accurate compared to the own self-knowledge that we might have. All right, that's all we have today. Thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.